Hello, everyone. Welcome. For those that are joining us on the live stream, welcome. We're excited to see so many people that are with us. We're just going to wait another minute or two to continue to welcome people that are joining the meeting. Wonderful to see so many people. We have over 275 screens with us right now. More coming in by the moment. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our community live stream this evening with Professor Stephen Berk on the Jews of Ukraine, a Complicated History. We are excited to be able to welcome so many people here, and we're thankful to the Kerzner family for sponsoring this evening as they do. And we have a special message to share from us from Michael Kerzner. I'll turn to that first.
Welcome back to our encore lecture featuring Professor Stephen Berk. I'm Michael Kerzner, and again, on behalf of our family, we're delighted to present this lecture for the community in partnership with Beth Tzedec, Beth Emeth, and the UJA Foundation of Toronto. My personal thanks again to Rabbi Stephen Wernick for overseeing this important program. Shortly after we last heard from Professor Berk, I called Rabbi Wernick to express my concern that we needed a regroup, since we needed to have a current perspective on the unprecedented events in Ukraine and Russia. And tonight, without a doubt, Stephen Berk will provide substantial dimension to the conflict from the perspective of history, and most importantly, the impact to the Jewish population in that region. And first and foremost, our thoughts are with those in the Ukraine, and we pray with those who pray and grieve with those who grieve. Tonight, we also remember my grandparents and uncle, whose names continue to be etched umbilically to our community. They taught their family, and particularly me, valuable lessons of steadfastness and resolve, and never being afraid to say things that others did not always want to hear. They taught us to be a powerful force for good in our community. And now, more than ever, especially with the events unfolding, we need to stand united as a Jewish community, whose cohesiveness rises in solidarity to protect the most vulnerable and those we deeply care about. Tonight, Sam and Sarah and Joseph Kerzner are remembered with their voices and leadership that in their day helped our community find their way. And on short notice, we welcome back our friend Professor Stephen Berk. It might be said of you, Stephen, that if you hadn't lived the life you have, your story might be the product of a screenwriter's overexcited imagination. We need to learn from you as we face the challenges in front of us. And please, God, we hope to see you and Roberta soon in person here in Toronto in the months ahead. We cordially invite you to address us tonight.
Thank you, Michael. Let me say that hopefully Stephen and his wife will join us. God willing, we are planning for a Shabbaton in Toronto the end of April 28th, 29th, and 30th. Professor Berk will be Thursday night, we hope, at Beth Emeth, and then Friday and Saturday over Shabbat at Beth Tzedec. And the topics are still to be determined, but you can rest assured that once we have them, we will publicize them. This evening, we also want to recognize our partners in making this evening possible, the Beth Tzedec Men's Club, Beth Tikvah, and Pride of Israel, in addition to Beth Emeth and Beth Tzedec, and of course, the Jewish Community Foundation of Toronto and the Kerzner family. Sof Sof Chaviv, I want to announce, I guess, that I am going to be going to Poland in a week from today. I leave for Poland as a small group of leadership from the GTA, and also in my volunteer role as a deputy chair of the Aliyah Committee for the Jewish Agency, to witness what is happening on the ground in terms of the refugee crisis and the work that the Jewish community from around the world is doing, not only for refugees in general, but specifically for the Jewish refugees from Ukraine. And now it seems there's a wave of Aliyah coming from Russia as well. If you want to, I'm attending rather on Monday, a week from tomorrow at 12:30 on our Facebook page to be able to give at least an initial report from the field on my Conversations Over Coffee program. So be sure to look for information about. Sorry, if you want to get a report from the field as to what is going on. With that, and without further ado, a man who needs no introduction to our community, because he's been a part of our community for 30 some years, coming and being our friend and our teacher, Professor Stephen Berk, on Ukraine and the Jews, A Complicated History. Stephen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rabbi, and I hope I'm sure you will have a safe and wonderful trip. And thank you, Michael Kerzner, for the very nice introduction. Let's begin at the beginning. I'm going to talk about the war, then we will talk about the Russian Orthodox Church. We'll talk a little bit about President Zelensky and his speech before the Knesset. We'll get a lot of things in here. So let's begin, as I said, at the beginning. What kind of man is this man, Vladimir Putin? What do we know about him? The most important thing to know about Mr. Putin is that he was a member of the KGB. Now, some of you may have heard me say this before, but as my second grade teacher, Mrs. Grossman, said, repetition is the mother of learning. So what does it mean that a man or a woman is in the KGB? The Germans have a good expression, it's a Weltanschauung, a worldview. A worldview of a KGB person is that the United States is the greatest enemy was the greatest enemy of the Soviet Union, is the greatest enemy of Russia. Whatever happens to the Soviet Union, whatever happens to Russia, whatever evil befalls Russia, it is the fault of the United States of America. The United States is the great enemy of Mr. Putin and of large numbers of Russians. Second point. A KGB person is taught that every individual and every collective has a weakness. That is, the role of the KGB or the agent of the KGB in dealing with individuals, find out that weakness, find out the weakness of a country, and then drive a locomotive right through it. And I think Mr. Putin, again, I'm telling you what I tell my students, I'm not being condescending here, is that perception is everything. I think one of the reasons that he went in was a belief that the United States and NATO were weak, that the United States was stretched too thin, all this talk about the pivot to Asia and really competing with China in East Asia. All of these things, I think played a role in leading Mr. Putin to do what he did. And then something else, and that something else is really significant. When Mr. Putin looks at the 20th century that saw 2 world wars and the Holocaust, massacres and slaughters in Cambodia, what does he say? He says the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union imploded in 1991. The Russian people were left bereft, and it is incumbent upon future leaders of Russia to reconstitute the Soviet Union. That's important stuff. You may not believe it. You may think it's silly, fanciful on his part, fantastical on his part, for want of a better word. But again, perception is everything. That's what he seems to believe. Now, that's the man that we're talking about. He is what in Russian would be called a chytrit shel yevek, a ruthless and cunning man. He is a very, very smart man. He's a thief, but he's a very, very smart man. So why does he go in here? Why does he do this? He is making his country a pariah state. Why is he doing it? I believe, and I think most people would argue, the issue of NATO is really significant. And I must say to you that I feel that, forgive me for saying this, on this particular issue, I think he's right on the question of the Ukraine entering NATO. And I say that to you, again, I'm a professor of Russian and Soviet studies. That doesn't mean that I tilt on the side of Russia. What Putin did was wrong. This is naked aggression. This is the murder of innocent men, women, and children. I'm explaining, I'm not exonerating. Never let explication become exoneration. From the vantage point of Russian history, the Russians have been invaded from the West over a 1,000-year period, first by the Swedes, then by the Poles, then by the French, and twice in the 20th century by the Germans. Now, this last one is the most catastrophic of them all. I have never met, with one exception, I have never met someone my age that knew his father. That is among Russian and Soviet emigres. Never, it's always the same thing. My mother told me she got a telephone call in 1941 after June 22nd. My father was at the shop. My father was at the university. My father was in the army. He can't come home. And the Russians lost, or the Soviet Union lost, to put this into perspective, the Soviet Union lost 27 million people in the Second World War. The United States, in both theaters of the war, lost less than 500,000. And another thing to keep in mind is that the Germans lost 5 million men in combat. 5 million men. 4,500,000 of those men were lost on the Eastern Front. This is not to slight the bravery of Canadian and American soldiers, but there should be no mistake, the Russians won the war. They bore the burden of the sacrifice. They inflicted the greatest danger. But the point here is that attacks have come from the West. And so I think he had a point. It doesn't justify what he did. But we'll pick this theme up later. In addition to that, there was, of course, miscalculation on his part. He thought this was going to be a romp, 2 or 3 days, 4 days at the most, and the Ukraine is going to be, again, conquered by Russia. That, of course, did not take place. And then there were some other issues here. A strong and prosperous Ukraine is a Ukraine that will be a magnet, again, attracting large numbers of Russians and putting Putin's authoritarian state really up to question. To give you an analogy, a prosperous Ukraine, part of the EU and part of NATO, will act in the same way that West Berlin and West Germany acted towards East Berlin and East Germany. One of the reasons that the wall comes toppling down on November 9th of 1989, one of the reasons that it comes down is large numbers of people living in East Germany, the millions of people living in East Germany, they understood. East Germany was stagnant, West Berlin was prosperous, West Germany was prosperous. So that's another reason for him, I think, to make sure that the Ukraine is at the very least neutral, and that the Ukraine could be, if not under his thumb, at least in a position where he could call the shots. So what do we know? It's a month later now. It's a month after the war began, almost exactly a month, maybe a month and a day. What do we know? Well, we know a number of things. One is that his miscalculation was indeed a miscalculation. The Ukrainians, with great courage and with weapons supplied by the United States and NATO, have proved to be a tremendous opponent. They're even going on to the counteroffensive. So that's one of the things we know. The more interesting things we know, after all, when the people are attacked, they're fighting for the homeland, one can understand why they are fighting so tenaciously, and indeed so skillfully. It's their turf. They know it better than the Russians. But the thing that is shocking to me, absolutely shocking, is the abysmal performance of the Russian army. We have been told ever since 2008, ever since Putin invaded Georgia and took away 2 provinces from Georgia, we have been told that he has put tens of billions of dollars into the Russian army. So if he's put the assessment is probably a correct one. He has poured a ton of money into the Russian army. So why have they performed so poorly? And indeed, everybody concedes the fact that they have, except for Putin himself, has performed, the Russian army has performed poorly. I would suggest a number of reasons for this. One, like many authoritarian leaders, Putin has promoted on the basis of loyalty rather than competence. Some of these guys who are running the Russian army, they're absolute hacks. The second point is going to be the country from Putin down to the ordinary Russian soldier is a kleptocracy. I told you before, Putin is a thief. The country is filled with thieves. Russian generals live very, very well. Now, what's going to happen here, or what in fact has happened? All that money that's poured into the Russian army, it's siphoned off by a group of Ganevim, a group of Ganovs. That's what they are. And so, why does the Russian army, why is there a convoy 40 miles stretched out there? Why are they running out of oil and gasoline? Because a lot of that has been siphoned off. A lot of the good equipment has been stolen for one reason or another. That's a problem, a very, very serious problem. And the most shocking thing of all, I mean, this is one of the great ironies of history. For those of you that are familiar with the history of the Second World War, it's that terrible winter of 1941 and 1942 that really rocked and socked the invading Wehrmacht, the invading German army. Hitler had assumed the war would be over in 12 weeks. The German army was not prepared for the winter. Wonder of wonders, the Russian army has not been prepared for the winter. Not enough antifreeze, not enough good equipment, not enough good clothing, not enough good shoes. Absolutely astonishing when one thinks of it. And then it is the very, let us say, tactical behavior of the Russian army. In the American army and in the German army, I must say, during the Second World War, and I presume in the Canadian army, there's a tradition of giving NCOs, non-commissioned officers, and second lieutenants and first lieutenants and captains a great deal of initiative. That's not the case. For those of you who are familiar, I don't know, if you saw the film Saving Private Ryan, for example, the first 30 minutes on June 6th of 1944 at Omaha Beach, it's not the generals who really win the day. It's the sergeants and the second lieutenants and the first lieutenants. They're the ones that get up the beach. In the case of the Russian army, there's a great deal of centralization of command. You know why so many Russian generals have been killed? It's astonishing. The figure now that we talk about is 7 Russian generals that were killed. Generals shouldn't be on the front line. Generals should be in the rear. But because local commanders, that is, again, these second lieutenants, first lieutenant captains, are not given the right, do not have the initiative, the generals have to be there. That's not a good way to win a war. So the abysmal performance of the Russian army, together with, again, the bravery of the Ukrainians. And I must say to you that there's something that has perplexed me. I'm not sure why this is not taking place. Everybody knows that Poland has been a staging area that is American equipment, NATO equipment, gathers together in Poland, crosses the border into the Ukraine, and enables the Ukrainian army to deal effectively with the Russian army. The most effective weapons are the Javelin anti-tank missiles and the ground-to-air missiles that are used against Russian helicopters and Russian planes. Now, I understand that. I understand what NATO and the United States are doing. What I don't understand is Russian behavior. I understand why the Russians will not attack Poland. That is the staging areas in Poland where all of this material is gathered. That's an attack on a NATO country. That can precipitate a war between Russia, NATO, and the United States. I understand that. But what I don't understand is why, when those convoys cross from Poland into the Ukraine, they are not attacked by the Russian Air Force. The only thing I can think of, and again, I am not privy to any special information, the only thing that comes to mind is that there's a quid pro quo. There's an understood agreement. And the quid pro quo is this: that is, the Russian Air Force will not attack those trucks or those convoys that are coming from Poland across the Ukrainian border. And the quid pro quo is that we will not establish a no-fly zone. That's the only thing I can think of. It is the height of folly for the Russians not to attack those supply convoys. And in fact, you could even argue it would be legitimate to do so. After all, the Israelis are mounting thousands of sorties, thousands of attacks upon Syria, because the Iranians are shipping military war material through Syria to Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. The Israelis attack them. That's the logical thing to do. But the Russians are not doing it. How long they will refrain from doing it, I do not know. Which, of course, raises the question: should we go in? Should NATO go in? Should a combined NATO and American force go in? And the answer is, again, I don't have a monopoly on the truth. This is one of the things we can talk about in a question and answer session. I am among those who say we should not go in. I'm not sure of what Putin's response would be. I'll put it this way. If President Biden gathered the best minds in the world and they were brought to Washington, they do their computer magic, and Biden asks them, what are the chances if we invade, if we go into the Ukraine to stop the Russians from slaughtering the Ukrainians? What is the possibility? What's the probability that Putin will respond with a tactical nuclear weapon, which, of course, once having been used, breaks the taboo against using nuclear weapons, and who knows where that will end? And if the best minds in the world tell President Biden, we've looked at all the figures, we've worked all the war games, all the game theory, and we come to the conclusion that if NATO and the United States invade the Ukraine, there's a 10% chance that President Putin will respond with using tactical nuclear weapons. So what do you do? 10%. What do you do? There's no question that we could help the Ukrainians. At the very least, a no-fly zone would help the Ukrainians. But again, we are not talking about losing one person, two persons, several hundred people, 7,000 people. A nuclear exchange, again, even a tactical nuclear exchange, can very quickly escalate into a total catastrophe. So what do you do? Because I align myself with those who say, it's not the right thing. You shouldn't do it. But again, history will judge. So where is all of this going to end? I mean, what are we talking about here? What are the possibilities here? The optimal possibility is that Putin will be taken down by the generals. Now, I say that's the optimal thing that can take place. I don't think that it's very, very likely, but it is possible. For those of you that like historical analogies, I'll talk to you about Valkyrie. Valkyrie was a plot by the German generals who on July 20th of 1944 tried to blow up Hitler at a meeting. Some of you have seen the film with Tom Cruise. It's one of the better films by that feature Tom Cruise. And it happens to be historically accurate. It's by sheer luck. Hitler Hitler just had very, very good luck. There were 38 assassination attempts against Adolf Hitler. 38! And not one of them succeeded. And it's only because the briefcase with the explosives was moved to a different part of the room that Hitler escaped with injury. But the fact of the matter is, I'm just trying to draw the analogy here for you, it is possible that a number of Russian generals, like the German generals acted in Valkyrie because they thought Adolf Hitler was leading their country into a disaster. The war was lost, there was no sense in fighting it. Is it possible that one or a number of Russian generals may argue, this man Putin is leading the country into a disaster, he has to be removed? That's possible, but it's just very unlikely. What about the Russian people? What will they do? Now, we know there is opposition. We know that thousands of people have gone out into the street, maybe even tens of thousands of people. Putin has arrested them. And I suggest to you, when you think of courage, not only think of the Ukrainians who are fighting for their homeland, but think of those Russians who have the chutzpah, the real courage to go out into the streets. This is not like protesting on a university campus. Whoever protests against Putin, Putin is not Stalin. There's no gulag there. But you don't cross Putin. You disappear. They find your body in the water. They find your body in the garage. So it is not easy to stand up against an authoritarian leader. And so these Russians have a good deal of courage. Can it turn the tide? Can it lead to his overthrow? I don't think so. Remember, he controls the media. The Russian people are not told. They're not told what in fact is happening here. They're told about great victories. In Russia, it's always, I must tell you, it's always a tension, as one writer put it. In Russia, there's a tension between the TV and the refrigerator. By that he meant, and that's what I'm saying to you, the Russian turns on the television, Russian man or woman turns on the television, and what do they see? What do the Russians see? They see Putin talking about the glorious victories of the Russian army, that Russia is back again, Russia is one of the world's great powers, Russia is a player on the international scene. That's what they see. Then the husband or the wife turns to the spouse and says, let's get a snack. They open up the refrigerator and there's nothing there, or very little there. That's the tension. Will it lead to something more? I mean, there's already a man, but he's in prison. Alex Navalny, he's in prison. If he survives prison, it'll be a miracle. So the point here is, I don't think that is very, very likely. It is possible. What is probably more probable is a negotiated settlement within the next month to 6 weeks. And I say that there are signs that that is taking place. First of all, negotiations are going on. Ukrainians and Russians are negotiating. So, and Putin is hurting. There's no question that he is hurting. We know that. The sanctions are taking a deep bite. He also is smart. This is no dummy that we're talking about. He knows what happened to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The Soviet involvement in Afghanistan was a nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union. He knows that. The longer this war goes on, the greater the opposition is going to be. So I think he wants out. The question is, the diplomatic jargon is, you got to find an off-ramp for Putin and an off-ramp for Zelensky. Now, everything is going to be in the spin, how you spin it. So I think the negotiations, and Zelensky himself, I must tell you, Zelensky is now talking about things that he should have spoken about several months ago. Now he has raised the issue. Now he has suggested that the Ukraine will not join NATO, that perhaps the Ukraine will be neutralized. That should have been said a while ago. So the point being here is, the Russians, if I had to predict what's going to happen in the next 4 to 6 weeks, the Russians are going to bomb and bomb and bomb. They're going to kill more people in order to put pressure on Zelensky. Zelensky will appeal, as he has done, and done very, very well, with the exception of his talk to the Knesset. The fact of the matter, he knows how to push the right buttons, and he will get as much aid as he can possibly do. as he possibly can. He is, and again, for an American audience, I think it would come closer to home. There's something to be said for being an actor. There really is. He is very much like Ronald Reagan. He is a great communicator. Reagan spoke magnificently. The inflection of his voice, the pregnant pauses, for want of a better expression, the 30-second soundbite. That's what a good actor does. And that's what Zelensky is able to do. But again, he has to confront the fact that his people are dying in fairly large numbers every day. And the infrastructure of the country is being destroyed. So Putin is under his own pressure, and Zelensky is under his pressure. So that's why I think negotiations are going to take place. Either they are taking place, and that's why I think in 4 to 6 weeks' time, this will come to an end. After all, from Putin's perspective, if someone has the nerve to talk to him, to talk truth to power, what has he accomplished? Now, he will spin it, to be sure, he will spin it in a way favorable to him. He's turned his country into a pariah state. In addition to that, he has done what no American president has ever been able to do, to tie the United States closer to NATO, and what no NATO leader has ever been able to do. That is what Putin has done, is brought NATO together in a very, very close way. Putin's policy before all of this was to split NATO. And what has he done? He's brought it closer together. So I think this is the way I think it's going to end. But now I ask the question, again, the loaded question. This question will be asked, some people are asking it now, some people ask it, let's say, when it's all over, but you can take this to the bank. In 5 to 10 years, when historians look back on this period, they're going to ask, was this avoidable? Could this war have been prevented? What are the roots of all of this? Now, again, it's hard to say. Let me begin by saying to you, I go back to 1989 and 1990. Was this a Versailles moment? Every student of history knows that the Allies socked it to the Germans at Versailles. Really, really put the screws to the Germans. And every historian who's worth his or her salt says that the Treaty of Versailles, with its war guilt clause, Article 231, blaming everything on the Germans, restricting the Germans, taking away German territory, played a very significant role in the rise of Adolf Hitler and the accession to power of the Nazis on January 30th of 1933. Was the West too triumphant? Did they take advantage? Could they have done something differently? How do you factor into this discussion what James Baker said in 1990? Baker was the American Secretary of State under the first President Bush. How do you factor this in? He talks to Gorbachev, and what he wants Gorbachev to do is to acquiesce to a unified Germany. Remember, the Berlin Wall had gone down on November 9th of 1989. He wants Gorbachev to sign on to a unified Germany. And to make the concession to Gorbachev, he says, here's the direct quote, "The boundaries of NATO will not extend an inch beyond the borders of a unified German state." 1993, Warren Christopher, President Clinton's Secretary of State, speaks to Boris Yeltsin and says, not everybody's coming into NATO. 1996, President Clinton goes to Prague and invites the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Poles, and the Hungarians to join NATO. Could things have been differently? Or, to look at it from the other side, these sanctions are hurting Russia a great deal. There's no question about that. Why weren't they put on Putin and Russia after he invaded Georgia? Why weren't they put on Putin after he invaded and took over the Crimea? And all those weapons that are flowing in now, enabling the Ukrainians to fight, why wasn't this done 5 years ago after Crimea? We seem to know it was coming. So again, I'm not sure. And this is what historians are going to have to deal with when this war is over and in the years to come. Was this thing avoidable? And then let's talk about some other things that I suggested to you, that I told you that I would speak about. What about the interesting role of the Russian Orthodox Church? Now, the history of Russian Orthodoxy is really a very important one. You cannot understand Russian history unless you understand the history of the Russian Orthodox Church. In 988, the Prince of Kiev, or Kiev, whatever language you want to use, Vladimir accepted Christianity. That's a turning point in Russian history. But the Christianity he accepted came from Constantinople, from the Byzantine Empire. There were two centers of Christianity, in Rome and in Constantinople. He took Constantinople. He took his Christianity from Greek Orthodoxy. Russian Orthodoxy is derivative of Greek Orthodoxy. That's important. There are ideas in Greek Orthodoxy that will pass into Russia, the supremacy of the Tsar over the church. No talk about a division of power between church and state. In Greek Orthodoxy, the ruler, the autocrat in Greek, or the Tsar in Russia, is superior to the Russian Orthodox Church. There's no tension between Pope and king, or Pope and Emperor, that you have in the West. The Tsar is the ruler. The ruler of the state is the ruler of the church. And then something even more important, you could argue. In the year 1054, the Patriarch in Constantinople, the leader of the Greek Orthodox Church, excommunicates the Pope in Rome. This is the Great Schism. And in return, the Pope in Rome excommunicates the Patriarch and his people in Constantinople. Do you know what this means? It means that Russia is open game. It's open season on Russia for the Catholic West. There are many tensions between Poland and Russia. Territorial place. Take a city like Pinsk. Is Pinsk the eastern part of Poland, or is it the western part of Russia? There's no question of territorial conflicts. But it is also true that in an age of religious enthusiasm, Catholic Poland is going to make war, as at that time Catholic Sweden makes war. That is, the Catholic world is going to make war upon Russia. The fact of the matter is Russia is under siege. We spent time talking about that. There's no need to repeat it. When Constantinople falls in 1453, the Russians now claim to be the legitimate heirs of Constantinople. The Tsar is now the ruler of all Eastern Orthodox Christians. Russia is the only true Christian faith. Or there's a very famous saying there. This is what is called the doctrine of the Third Rome. The first Rome fell because of sin. The second Rome, Constantinople, fell because of heresy. Moscow is the third Rome. There shall be no other. The idea that the only true Christians in the world are the Russian Orthodox Church, and it is incumbent upon them to save the rest of Christendom, wherever it may be. Now, under the Tsars, there was a reciprocal relationship. The Tsarist government for 400 years protected and gave support to the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church supported the Tsarist government. That's why I have in my office a poster from the Russian Revolution, in which it is, again, it's a communist propaganda piece, but it's a very handsome piece. And that is, there's the Russian peasant, the muzhik, with his plow, and he's putting, who is he carrying on top of him? The nobleman, the Tsar, and the Russian Orthodox priest. Comes the revolution, the Russian Orthodox Church is under attack. Priests will be crucified along church walls. There will be a museum of atheism. This is not only an attack on the Russian Orthodox Church, an attack upon the Jews as well. Comes the demise of the Soviet Union. Everything opens up now. The Russian Orthodox Church is like a coiled spring. And the men who run it, particularly the present patriarch, Patriarch Kirill, subscribes to an idea that's long-standing in the West. It goes to the idea of Moscow, the Third Rome. Not only is Russia the only true Christian religion, but the West is decadent. Why is the West decadent? Now, don't get offended by what I'm saying to you. These are not my views. These are his views. Homosexuality is a sin. It must be prosecuted. Same-sex marriages, an abomination. That's part of what the Russian Orthodox Church sees as the decadence of the West, alongside of the West's concern with materialism. When Putin says he's going to recreate the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church says, you're absolutely right, and we will give you all of our support. Now, that puts a great deal of tension on the Ukrainians. Large numbers of Ukrainians are in a derivative of Russian Orthodoxy. This is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They have a problem now. What are they going to do? Are they going to pray for Putin? They can't pray for Putin. And many of the Russian Orthodox churches are really deviating away. They're moving away. There's an independent Orthodox church, in the Eurocephalus, Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They will have nothing to do with Putin. And then, if I haven't lost you already, there is what is called the Uniate Church. The Uniate Church prays the same liturgy, except it recognizes the supremacy of the Pope. The Uniates are considered to be Catholics. The center of Uniate Christendom in the Ukraine is in the city of Lviv. Now, just parenthetically, Lviv, to show you the difficulties of the whole period and of the history and of the Jewish history there as well, this is a city with 4 names. If you're Ukrainian, it's Lviv. If you're a Pole, it's Lvov. If you're a Russian, it's Lvov. If you're a Jew or a German, it's the city of Lemberg. Now, I go into this only to tell you, this is not a semantic game that we're playing here, because these different nationalities will claim it, and the Jewish position is always difficult. The real struggle in Lviv is between the Poles and the Ukrainians. That is in the interwar period. And the problem is going to be, the Ukrainians turn to the Jews, are you with us? The Poles turn to the Jews, are you with us? Whatever choice the Jews made, it was the wrong choice. So, the Russian Orthodox Church is a powerful bulwark of Putin. And Putin is the first Russian ruler since 1917 to go to church. Is he a true believer? I can't say that. But he goes to the church. To show you the difference in tone in Russia now, if you went to Russia when the communists were in power, that's before 1991, and you went to what was called Leningrad, and then later they called it St. Petersburg again. If you went to Leningrad, they took you to the Peter and Paul Fortress. That's where all the Russian revolutionaries that the Tsarist government could get its hands on were put in prison. Incidentally, more than you ever wanted to know, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe is arrested and put in the Peter and Paul Fortress. When you went there when the Soviet Union was in place, what did you see? They took you to these cells where the Russian revolutionaries were imprisoned. Ever since Putin has come to power, when you go to the Peter and Paul Fortress, they don't take you to those cells anymore. They take you to the church in the Peter and Paul Fortress, where the vaults, where the Tsars and the Tsarinas were buried. That's where they take you to. So Putin has aligned himself with the historical tradition, the monarchical tradition, and he's also aligned himself with the Russian Orthodox Church. That's important in understanding where he gets his support from. Now, what about Israel in all of this? What's happening there? The Israelis are in a tough position, and Zelensky has made it even more difficult for them. Now, this is a magnificent leader of his country. Usually he pushes the right button. And the right button is, again, he goes to England and he quotes Winston Churchill, we'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them everywhere, and so on. He did the right, he goes to Sweden, he says the same things, always on Zoom, but he's saying the right things. Either he was ill-advised or his passion got the worst of him. He said some really silly things. Now, don't misconstrue this. What's happening in the Ukraine is terrible, but it's not the Holocaust. If it was the Holocaust, we wouldn't be talking about thousands of dead Ukrainians. We'd be talking about hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians, and that's not the case. And then to say that Israel has a special debt to pay to the Ukrainians because 2,600 Ukrainians saved Jews during the Second World War. As the writer and historian Gil Troy has pointed out, if you want to sidestep history, it's all right, but don't distort history. In the Second World War, tens of thousands of Ukrainians volunteered to fight for the SS. Collaboration was ubiquitous throughout the Ukraine, absolutely ubiquitous. The Ukrainians would identify the Jews, transport the Jews, guard the Jews, and kill the Jews. Don't distort. You want to sidestep it, but don't distort it. But given the fact that so many Israelis are either Holocaust survivors or the descendants of Holocaust survivors, that speech did not go over well. Nor, in fact, did it go over well when he put Israel under the gun. I said, you got to do more. You got to give us weapons. You got to give us Iron Dome. Doesn't he understand? I understand. He's desperate. He will appeal for aid for everyone. The Israelis are in a very difficult position. I mentioned to you before, remember, that Iran is shipping weapons through Syria to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, to Islamic Jihad and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. These organizations want to destroy the state of Israel. There are 190 countries in this world. Only one is targeted for destruction. And the country that targets Israel is Iran. There's a digital clock in Tehran that counts down from the year 2040, minute by minute, because the Iranian position is that sometime between now and 2040, Israel will be destroyed. That's why Israel has to bomb in Syria. But the Russians are in Syria. The Russians are supporting Bashar Assad. Netanyahu was able to work out a deal, which apparently Bennett has continued, with Putin, allowing the Israelis to intercept that war material coming from Iran, as long as Israeli aircraft do not bomb Assad's forces. And do not, of course, bomb the Russians that are stationed there. That has allowed the Israelis to carry out well over 1,000 missions against Syria. If the Israelis tilt too far in dealing with the Ukraine, that is in supporting the Ukraine, and Putin says, nuts to you, we're not going to allow you to bomb Syria anymore, Israelis may die because of the increased weaponry that will be acquired by Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and Hamas. The Israelis are in a difficult position here. And for people in the United States, on CNN, for example, and this is, I think, instructive for all of us, be very careful of what you read. Here's one of the best adages that concerns war. In war, the first casualty is the truth. Everybody lies through their teeth. There's anything that comes out of Russia, don't believe. The Russians lie all the time. But the Ukrainians are desperate. They will exaggerate their losses. They will exaggerate Russian losses. They will demand things from other people and other countries. But not everybody. Everybody has their own interests here. India has an interest here. India gets nearly all of its military hardware from Russia. The Chinese are not tilting. If they're tilting anywhere, they have their own problems. China is isolated in Asia. The only ally it has is Russia. People have their own interests. Nations have their own interests. Israel has a real interest. And given that the fact that Israel is in such an untenable position, the Israelis have acted very, very well. They have voted correctly. They have provided the Ukraine with humanitarian aid. And again, to give you an example, I read about 10 newspapers a day. One of them that I read is the Washington Post. A half-page article in the Washington Post took off after Israel for not giving all sorts of weapons and all sorts of, or what is called Pegasus. That's an Israeli spy technique or spy technology that allows you to go into any cell phone that you have. And the writers of the article berated the Israelis for not giving Pegasus to the Ukraine. Not once in a half-page article, not once Was there any mention of the difficult position that Israel was in? So, taken all together, the Israelis, I think, have acted fairly well. They have acted more than fairly well. They have acted very well. So I come back to the two questions. Where is this going to end? I think it's going to end in a negotiated peace. Was it avoidable? That's for historians to judge. Never let, however, again, as I said to you before, never let explication become exoneration. When I explain why Putin does things, I am not exonerating him. This man is a murderer. Thousands of people are dying. He's carrying out terror bombings. That's what he's doing. I'm trying to explain to you why he does it. It doesn't give any justification for why he is doing it. And then think again, was all of this avoidable? Were mistakes made? Why do I think again we're moving in a direction that I think toward peace? Well, we know that Putin is hurting. We know that he's begun to arrest some of the people, his intelligence people. We know that. And Zelensky is talking about, again, not joining NATO and again, neutralizing the Ukraine. I don't know what the future is going to bring. I'll leave you with this. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Whatever happens in the Ukraine is not a threat either to Canada or to the United States or to the state of Israel. What happens in the negotiations between the United States and the 5+1 on the one hand and Iran on the other to resurrect the nuclear agreement of 2002-2015, that is the most important issue confronting Israel, the United States, and indeed all of Western Europe and Canada as well. If the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, all bets are off. All bets are off on the survival of Israel and indeed the possibility. Today, Iranian missiles have a range of, let's say, 3,000, 3,500 miles. The day will come in the not too distant future when Iranian ballistic missiles will have ranges of 5,000 to 6,000 miles. All things are on the, let's say, all possibilities now become valid. I don't mean to leave you in a pessimistic note. I'm saying, but the optimistic note is I think this will come to an end. The sooner it comes to an end, the better off all of us are going to be. All right, my friends. If I haven't disturbed you enough, let the questions rip.
You know, the job of a rabbi, and I suppose the job of a historian, Stephen, is to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. So if we're not disturbed, we're not paying attention about what's going on in the world. There are a number of questions for you. I'm just going to go through them as they appear in my chat box. The first is, how would you assess President Biden's reaction in dealing with this challenge?
I voted for President Biden. It wasn't an enthusiastic vote. The alternative was not viable for me, so I voted for President Biden. His reaction has been superb. He orchestrated the sanctions, brought NATO together, has provided equipment, war materiel for the Ukrainians. In short, his response after the invasion, I thought has been superb. But the question I would ask is, why wasn't there more give on Biden's part before the invasion? Biden kept saying, and other people kept saying, the Ukraine is a sovereign state. It has the right, a sovereign state has the right to contract an alliance with any group or any nation that it wants to do so. That is a good principle, except it's a little bit hypocritical when an American president says it, or an American says it. The United States went to the brink of nuclear war in October of 1962 to prevent a sovereign state, Cuba, that had invited the Soviet Union to put missiles in Cuba. Ever since the promulgation of the Monroe Doctrine, the United States has not allowed any foreign country to establish a base in Latin America. So how can an American president say the Ukraine has the right to contract any alliance? Why wasn't there any give on Biden's part and NATO's part before? Now Zelensky says we're not going to join NATO, or he's implying we will not join NATO. Now, it may have been that the whole issue of NATO was a smokescreen. It may have been. that Putin is more interested in other things, again, resurrecting the Soviet Union, occupying the Ukraine, and so on. But I think had President Biden and had NATO and had Zelensky made it clear, they could have said, well, joining NATO, we'll deal with that 25 years from now. Who knows what's going to be 25 years from now? The only thing I know for sure is I'm not going to be here. But besides that, nothing else. Or they could have done with the Ukraine what they did with Austria. In the middle of the 1950s, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain agreed that Austria would become a neutral country, would not have weapons, and would not contract an alliance either with the Warsaw Pact or with NATO. That could have been done. I don't know. Again, we do not know. That's done, we do not know. But these are questions that historians will ask.
You spoke about Israel's challenge in this crisis. Can you comment on the role that Israel's taking with regard to shuttle diplomacy?
On the one hand, I'm delighted that an Israeli prime minister who has good relations both with Putin and Zelensky is invited, apparently by both, to act as a mediator. That's nice. For a country of 10 million people, that's really a very, very nice thing. That Israel is now really at the center of all of this. But you know what? When this is over and there's a negotiated settlement, no one's going to be happy with that. No one's going to be happy. That's the essence of compromise. You get something, but you lose something. I worry that both the Russians and the Ukrainians, if Israel is the mediator, Israel will be blamed. I worry about that. Now, do I worry about a growth of anti-Semitism in Russia and in the Ukraine because of the Israeli involvement? It's hard. I'm always concerned. These are countries in which anti-Semitism has been endemic for 1,000 years. But one thing you can say about Putin, now, if he turns out to be an anti-Semite tomorrow, think that some rabbi told you that, what I just said. Don't blame me. But the one thing you can say about Putin is he has not used the anti-Semitic card. Russian rulers, Tsarist and communist rulers, have always played two cards when in trouble. Play the nationalist card. That's what Putin did in the Crimea. That's probably one of the reasons why he invaded the Ukraine. In the Crimea, when he invaded the Crimea, his popularity rating skyrocketed. Now it was down to 58%. Played the nationalist card. The other card that every Russian ruler played, communist and Tsarist leader, can be summed up in a very, very interesting Russian expression. Bezhidov spasai Zhidov. That is, beat the kikes and save Russia. Putin has never played the anti-Semitic card. The men under him, the so-called Siloviki, the men of power, the KGB companions, they have played it, but not Putin. Putin has never played the anti-Semitic card. In the Ukraine, again, the Ukrainian history here is a difficult one. The country runs with Jewish blood. I mean, beginning with Bogdan Khmelnytsky in 1648, the slaughter of Jews, anywhere between 60,000 and 100,000 Jews, massive rape of Jews, sending into slavery of Jews. All of that took place. Pogroms in the 19th century. If the Holocaust did not take place, the worst experience of the Jewish people in the 20th century would be the pogroms in the Ukraine in 1919 and 1920. I spoke to you about the collaboration. Now that leads, again, will it lead to anti-Semitism in the Ukraine? I do not know. There's one segment of the Ukrainian army, a very small segment, the so-called Azov battalion. These are neo-Nazis. They carry around paraphernalia and insignias that look very much like swastikas. They're neo-Nazis, they're anti-Semites. They're integrated, they have been integrated. Supposedly they've been moderated and integrated into the Ukrainian army. But that's only a small portion of the Ukrainian army. So I don't know what's going to happen. And then it raises the very interesting question, which the rabbi can deal with better than I can. And that is, it's a classic question. Can you hold the sons, the grandsons, and the great-grandsons responsible for the sins of their ancestors? That's a problem. Especially, we're not talking about the 19th century. There are people who are alive, Ukrainian The Ukrainians, the Holocaust in the Ukraine was, as the French priest Francis de Louvois put it, that's the Holocaust by bullets. 1,500,000 Jews were killed in the Ukraine. They were killed by the Einsatzgruppen. Einsatzgruppen C and D operate in the Ukraine. But every student of the Holocaust in the Ukraine knows that their work was facilitated by the collaboration of large numbers of Ukrainians. So, can you hold these people responsible? That is the people now? The answer is, I think, no. But again, the possibility does exist that would be an outbreak of anti-Semitism. I don't think that's likely, nor do I think it's likely in Russia.
So I'm going to comment because you invited me to comment on,
Yes,
on that. I think the answer to whether or not you can hold the children accountable to the sins of the parents depends upon what it is that the children do as a result of those sins.
Yeah.
Take Germany, for example. The German society has really worked very, very hard to understand, to own, and to make amends for their actions. And so I think that the same is true for anybody, right? Like, for the Ukrainians, it would be the same would be true for that as well. And whether or not anti-Semitism comes back as a societal force as opposed to a fringe force, which is what the Azov brigade is going to be the test of that.
That is correct.
You've kind of answered the next question a little bit, which is what's the outlook for the Jewish communities in Russia if Ukraine were to win? You don't believe that it sounds like you don't believe that there's a likeliness of anti-Semitism breaking out.
I don't think there is, but what I think there will take place, it's already taking place, is a growth in repression in Russia. And I think we will see a growing number of Russian Jews, most of whom are middle class, most of whom had decided to stay in Russia. I think we will see more of them leave the country.
Well, I can tell you from my work with the Jewish Agency that that's already started. There's 25,000 open Russian Aliyah applications at this moment in just the last 4 weeks.
Yeah, that's a consequence, I think, of the growing repression and the deteriorating economic situation within Russia as a consequence of the sanctions.
From the perspective of the Jewish Agency, between the Ukrainians that have already arrived, the open Ukrainian applications and the open Russian applications at this moment, there's an expectation of almost 100,000 new Olim coming in the next several months.
I would be very surprised at that, Rabbi. I really would. I know that's the expectation. Russian Jews who leave, Jews from Russia who leave, they will go to a number of places, including Israel. They will not want to go back.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying.
They will not. They will not want to go back. Ukrainian Jews and Ukrainians in general, they will go. Many of them will go back once the war comes to an end.
Well, depending upon who's got the upper hand in the conclusion to the war.
Assuming the war comes to an end, and assuming the Ukraine is still there, it's still a sovereign state. The Russian occupying forces are gone.
Right.
What we will see will be a Marshall Plan for the Ukraine. Tens of billions of dollars will be poured into the Ukraine, reconstructing the country. And I think Ukrainian Jews and Ukrainians, many of them will go back. Especially those, the largest number, of course, are those that are in Poland and in neighboring countries. That's close to the Ukraine. They will go back.
I think you're right. Here's a question about NATO, and that is that if Ukraine manages to eke out a win in this war, do you see that there's even a greater need than before for Ukraine to join NATO in order to protect themselves from future Russian aggression?
Yeah, look, from a Ukrainian perspective, joining NATO is a good thing. It gives them the ultimate guarantee that they will never be attacked again. But short of that, or before that, if they start talking about it, the war will never come to an end. The Russians will not allow the Ukraine to become part of NATO. They just won't do it for the reasons that I explained to you. I'm not saying those reasons are justified, but from the Russian perspective, the Ukraine cannot enter NATO. And I must, again, I will say to you, to show you how things could have been a little bit different. In 2019, NATO and American forces, together with Ukrainian military people, had a joint exercise in the Ukraine. In retrospect, that was crazy. That was provocative. You don't do that. You just don't. Now, again, more history than anybody ever wanted to know. In the 1990s, there was a debate in the United States among academicians, East Europeanists, the people who taught East European history, not Russian history. The East Europeanists said, you've got to extend the borders of NATO. You got to get Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. We owe it to them. These countries have been occupied either by the Russians to the east or the Germans to the west. This is the ultimate guarantee that we can give to these people who have suffered so much. People who taught Russian history and Soviet history said, don't do it. You do it, you're coming right close to the Russian heartland. You're coming close to St. Petersburg. You're coming close to Moscow. The Russian people will not tolerate, no Russian ruler will do it. You'll put them in a very defensive position. That was the argument. The argument that won was the East Europeanist argument. And so we extended the borders, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and all of those East European countries that had formerly been in the Warsaw Pact. Was this the right thing to do? I don't know.
Time will tell. Here's a question about media. What do you think of American and Canadian mass media's coverage of Ukraine? The questioner states that they find them to be quite ahistorical in contrast to your talk. That the media, our media, seems to be focusing mostly on videos of refugee misery, military news, etc. What is it that you see?
There's a visceral, a gut sympathy for the Ukrainians. I mean, this is a naked, a blatant act of aggression. And what the old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You see the picture of the refugees, you see the dead people, you see the bombed out houses and so on. But there is a certain amount of hysteria. There really is. And I worry about that. I must tell you, I was telling someone the other night, as a professional historian, I'm supposed to tell my students that if you study history, you get a handle on the present. As one French historian put, you cannot explain the present by the present. Everything has a history. And if you're really gifted and lucky, maybe you can get a handle on what's going to happen in the future. I think that's true. That's what historians do. But I would also say, sometimes look at your present. Look at what's happening in the present, and sometimes you may have a better handle on the West, on what happened in the past. So I'll give you an example. I think what's happening now, there's a certain amount of hysteria. You don't allow a Russian orchestra conductor to come because he's Russian. You don't allow Russian athletes to perform. You attack anything that is Russian, And why I say this, it pertains more to my country, but also to your country as well. And that is, now I understand the hysteria that must have swept over the United States after Pearl Harbor. And what the United States and Canada did, I was not aware of this. Canada did the same thing the United States did. It incarcerated Japanese who had lived in Canada, and more, 120,000 Japanese Americans who lived in the United States were incarcerated in detention camps. The hysteria was tremendous, absolutely tremendous. This is not to justify it, but the United States was attacked. Americans died on December 7th. 2,500 Americans died on December 7th of 1941. No American or Canadian has died here. And yet look at the way we are doing. Look at this excoriation of everything that is Russian. So I think for the most part, again, I read 10 newspapers. I also read, when I can get it, the National Post and sometimes the Globe and Mail. By and large, their coverage is correct. They are sidestepping that history that I just spoke to you about, but I can understand why they do that. But again, how can you have any sympathy? How can you not have sympathy for the Ukrainians? newspaper people, people in the media are flesh and blood. And for the most part, they're reacting, I think, intelligently and so on. The caveat I would make there, certainly for the American press, certainly for the New York Times and the Washington Post, is that when it comes to covering Israel, it's absolutely terrible. There the bias comes through.
All right. So when you come back in April, Iran's going to be part of our main topic. And
Yes.
There's a question that's being asked that I think is really an important one. And that is, how might this war change U.S. thinking with regard to Iran and the desirability of reaching a deal with Iran on nuclear weapons? It would seem, I'm paraphrasing the question and asking my own question in here as well. It would seem if we've learned anything from this, it's that nations that have nuclear weapons kind of, they do what they're supposed to do. They deter other nations from having nuclear weapons, of engaging with them. And so I hear in the question a concern that if Iran were to get nuclear weapons, doesn't that do exactly what Iran wants, which is make it harder for anybody to attack them?
It does. It certainly does. The Iranians may draw a lesson from this, that they should have nuclear weapons. And that would be most unfortunate, because the Iranians will use nuclear weapons as a cover to increase terror attacks all over the Middle East, because who's going to stop them? But it is also, it's not true that nuclear weapons deter war. They deter a certain type of war. After all, India and Pakistan have fought a number of wars. Both have nuclear weapons. India and China have fought border skirmishes. What it means is, if you have nuclear weapons and you're involved and you're on the winning side, you know you can only go so far, because the other side, the losing side, may use a nuclear weapon. Now, the other thing is, in terms of what's happening in the Ukraine, look at NATO's behavior, look at American behavior, and I suspect Canadian behavior as well. We're not going to go in and help the Ukrainians. We'll give them weapons, we will not help the Ukrainians, because they're not a member of NATO. If you're sitting in Taiwan, or you're sitting in Tel Aviv, what does that mean? Especially in Taiwan. Does it mean that if President Xi launches an attack on Taiwan, that you'll give us weapons, but you will not come to our aid? You won't send the 6th Fleet, that is the East Asian Fleet of the United States, you won't send them in? Does it mean that Israel, we'll give you weapons, Israel, if you're attacked. We'll give you all the weapons in the world, but you got to handle it yourself. We will not put American boots on the ground. We will not provide air cover for you. That's another aspect of this. So, Rabbi, you're absolutely right, and the questioner is right. It pays to have nuclear weapons in this world.
Yeah,
now, the other...
I would just want to add to that. I mean, look at North Korea just launched a test of a very powerful ICBM, which is clearly a message that it wants to send in the midst of all of this too. So it's
yeah. Now,
lots to be said for that.
With the North Koreans are interested in two things at the most. One, preventing an attack upon them, and maybe ultimately somehow you reuniting the country, taking over South Korea. They're not going anywhere beyond the Korean Peninsula. The Iranians have much greater ambitions than that. One is the destruction of Israel, and two is to spread Shiite Islam, at the very least, to the rest of the Middle East, and probably to the rest of the world. There's a difference there.
Yeah.
And what scares me about the acquisition of a nuclear weapon by the Iranian government is what President Rafsanjani is reputed to have said some years ago when he was the president. A student asked him at a forum, why are we spending all this money, on nuclear stuff? Why are we spending all this money? We can't use it. If we attack the Israelis will attack us, because everybody knows Israel has nuclear weapons. And Rafsanjani said, that's an interesting question. He said, first of all, one 40 kiloton weapon over Tel Aviv, and Israel ceases to exist as a viable state. That happens to be true. The second thing he said, which I'm not sure of, but the second thing that he did say it, the second thing he said in response to another student's question was, If the Israelis attack us, if we attack Israel and the Israelis attack us, when the smoke clears, we will be here and they will not be. That's scary stuff. It really is. We're talking about a religious, I'll use Salo Baron's old expression. We are talking about a religiously enthusiastic regime. Who knows? Who knows? There are some people in Iran that say, you know how you bring the hidden imam back? To usher in the Islamic Messianic age? You destroy the Israelis. Eliminate Israel from the face of the earth, and the hidden imam will return. Now, that's
my
maybe
response.
a fringe group. But it's scary when you factor that stuff in. So what I said at the very end of my lecture, or close to the end of the lecture, what is happening in the Ukraine is of great importance. Putin has violated international law and international order. But I believe it will stop with the Ukraine. I don't think he's going into Poland. I don't think he's going to trigger a nuclear exchange or war with the United States and NATO. With the Iranians, that's a different issue.
So on that, there's a question that if Putin's allowed to remain in power after a future ceasefire, how does the world come to terms with the war criminal remaining a member of international organizations?
The only way, there are a number of things. One, Putin may be removed from power by the generals. That's number one. Putin may be removed by power, let's say a popular uprising. Or the day will come when Putin just leave. He gets too old, whatever it may be. Or there's a change in administration. And Putin has made Russia a pariah country. And to get back into the good graces of the rest of the world, a post-Putin government may be told, you want to get back? You turn him over to the International Criminal Court. That's what happened with Milosevic, for the leader of former Yugoslavia, the leader of former Serbia. That is, for Serbia to enter into the world, to be included in the European Union, for Serbia to be treated not as a pariah state, the Serbs had to turn over those war criminals or people who were accused of being war crimes in dealing with Bosnia. That may happen. Again, no one can predict the future. No, really, I'm being trite now. No one can predict the future. We just don't know about that. But for the short run, he will remain in power, and a lot depends on the negotiations. What does he want, and what is he going to get? I can tell you what he wants. He wants, again, Ukraine doesn't enter NATO. Number two, that those provinces that he separated from the Ukraine, he wants them to be annexed into Russia. He wants, number three, that the world, and the Ukraine in particular, accept the acquisition of the taking of the Crimea. He wants, number four, an end to all sanctions. That's what he wants. How much he will get, I don't know.
Can you comment on post-Shoah generations of non-Jewish Ukrainians in relation to the resurgent fascism, the 2014 cabinet, attacks on Roma in 2018 that the US Holocaust Museum, for example, condemned?
If I understand correctly, it is fascism in the Ukraine since the Ukraine became independent. Is that the nature of the question?
Yes.
And the answer is, yeah. Look, this is a country an area in which anti-Semitism has been prevalent for over almost 1,000 years. Are there anti-Semites in the Ukraine? The answer is yes. Some of them are real nasty, such as the people in the Azov battalion? The answer is yes. But again, it's thrown up in our face all the time. For all of their anti-Semitism, the Ukrainians elected Zelensky, a Jew, as president. I suspect, and I'm not being condescending or cynical, that probably most Ukrainians didn't even know he was Jewish. But that's besides the point. He is Jewish, and he is the president. Yes, I think the Ukrainians have turned the corner. I would be more positive. The rabbi is absolutely correct when he talks about Germany. I've been to Germany a number of times, and I can tell you, the Germans have come clean. There's no Holocaust denial in Germany, no Holocaust denial at all. The Germans have conducted their own war crimes trials. The only caveat that I would say there is Germans do not deny the Holocaust. But what you get from older Germans, when you meet them and you talk to them, is, of course, we know Germany was responsible for the killing of 6 million Jews. But that was the job. The people who did this were the people in the SS and the Nazi Party. Our gallant soldiers in the Wehrmacht, the German army, had nothing to do with the murder of Jews. And that's a crock. The German army was responsible for the murder of large numbers of Jews. But in the Ukraine, the problem is no apology given for what some Ukrainians did during the war. The Ukrainians have honored Stepan Bandera, who was a Ukrainian nationalist, and whose forces were responsible for the murder of Jews.
Got a nice statue in the center square.
Well, and of course,
if it's still standing.
Well, if it's still standing. But in Kiev, it's interesting. You never see in the pictures. You see the pictures of saints, of the Ukrainian people who beatified. That you see, but you don't see pictures. The major statue in Kiev that towers over the city is the statue of Bogdan Kunlitsky. This is the Ukrainian Cossack leader who was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Jews.
Right.
That you don't see pictures of that. So look, it is one of the better things that Stalin said, maybe the only decent thing that he ever said. He said, history towers over the present like a mountain. It's always there. You cannot expect people to eradicate completely their past. It's part of them. Kunlitsky is a great nationalist hero for them. So the answer to the question is, yes, there's anti-Semitism in the Ukraine. Yes, there's anti-Semitism in Russia. There's anti-Semitism everywhere. The question that one has to ask when dealing with anti-Semitism is, does it exist in a magnitude large enough to prevent a physical threat to the Jewish community, or less than that, but still important, does it exist in sufficient magnitude to obstruct the entrance of Jews in any country in which they're living into the mainstream of society? And in the question of Canada, question of the United States, the answer is these things don't exist. Are there anti-Semites in Canada? Yes. Are there anti-Semites in the United States? Yes. But we are not threatened with physical violence, and our entrance into the mainstream of our countries is not impeded by anti-Semitism. In the Ukraine, in the post-period, the post-Soviet period, it doesn't seem to be an issue.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Really a wonderful evening of education and of dialogue. Clearly a lot of questions from those that are watching. It's unfortunate that we don't have time to get to all of them. We put a number of things in the chat. We want to invite you to join our larger community together at Beth Emeth on April 24th for an evening with Dara Horn and her new book, People Love Dead Jews. That's going to be April 24th at 7 p.m. at Beth Emeth. We also want to remind you that Professor Berk is coming in person to our community, God willing, April 28th, 29th, and 30th, the 28th at Beth Emeth, the 29th and 30th at Beth Tzedec. More information on that can be found on our website, www.beth-tzedec.org. And finally, as I said, I am heading next week with a small group of leadership from the GTA to Poland to witness what's happening on the ground in order to be able to come back and share a view from the field and to encourage our community to support in a variety of different ways, including financial, the need that is present currently for the rescue of Ukrainian Jews and what it seems like is a growing number of Russian Jews that are seeking to leave Russia for Israel as well as other locations. So be sure to look for information from me on that, which will be available maybe something on April 4th. It all depends. That's the first day that I get there, but certainly April 11th, that'll be the topic of my conversation over coffee, 12:30 on Monday on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks to the Kerzner family, to the Jewish Foundation of Toronto, to Beth Tzedec Men's Club, Beth Emeth, Beth Tikvah, and Pride of Israel for the partnerships for this evening. Thank you all for being here. Stay safe.